So, you know the drill by now. Nothing weird about it at all. It's the two of us pretending to have a private conversation in front of several hundred people in an echoey hall.
Where's the fire, Mike?
Yes. So I hope you're comfortable with that.
Yes, thank you.
Good. There is no fire. Tragically, the budget couldn't run to it, and apparently health and safety requirements meant that it's just you, me, and some exciting mineral water. What we do have is a great story. I think your story and the BuzzFeed story is a really interesting one, and it ties into so many of the things that we've heard this morning and that we're going to hear later on. We've got a room full of people who are going on that same journey at various different stages. So I want to spend a few minutes just finding out how you did it, how it went well, and sometimes how it went wrong, and just giving us a little picture of how you got where you are. So before we get there, I mean, many of us know BuzzFeed. I'm sort of aware of it. I suspect that tragically, I'm way too old to be in your original core target audience.
Not in our core demographic.
Exactly, I am not in your core demographic.
Although neither am I.
Well, for the elderly amongst us, could you explain, well, two things really. What is BuzzFeed and how did you get there? How did you end up sort of in BuzzFeed?
Sure. So as many of you know, BuzzFeed started back in 2008 with Jonah Peretti founding it. He actually came from the Huffington Post, where he was a founder there. And we're now leading a news and entertainment site in the US, although our business has grown to include video. Online video is a large portion of it as well. And it was back in 2013 that we began expanding internationally. I should start, though, by saying I came to BuzzFeed from the finance world, so a bit of a different background. I had been working at Goldman Sachs in the tech, media, and telecom investment banking group, and basically was working with companies like BuzzFeed, fast-growing, raising late-stage rounds of capital or going public. And I saw how much fun the owners of those businesses and the leaders were having, and I really wanted to be on that side. So I got to BuzzFeed about 2.5 years ago, and it's been a really fun journey since then.
So you jumped the fence from the finance side to the media side.
I did. I got off the sidelines.
And for those of us that think we ought to be paid more, just reassure us, is it just way cooler in media compared to finance?
It's just way cooler, exactly. Don't wish to be on that side, so you're all in a good spot.
I'm very glad. There are compensations then.
Yeah.
So give us some sense of BuzzFeed's own sort of growth before you began to think about, well, let's go international. Yep. It had taken off from quite a relatively small start, although a great sort of CV of its founder, yep. But it took off remarkably quickly. It almost invented viral, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. So when I joined in April 2013, it had just reached a kind of significant scale in the US, where you started to see it in your Facebook feed and your Twitter feed, almost every day. But around then we had 40 million unique visitors per month, versus now we're at 200 million unique visitors per month. But that was when we were only in the US, number one, and we're obviously much earlier in our journey. Now we have 9 international sites outside of the US, and have 200 million unique visitors, of which about half come from outside the US.
So give me a sense of the content that was driving that. You've mentioned that now video is so much more important, but when we think about the original idea of viral, everyone has a cat joke somewhere.
Yes.
It was, how many cats can there be in the world? But what was the content that made BuzzFeed so addictive, that turned it into this kind of, designer drug of online consumption? What did it actually do? Yeah,
I think Jonah's founding premise for the company was the hallmark of whether content is high quality is whether you share it with a friend. Not just do you click on it, not just do you generate the page view and read it, but do you read it and say, oh my gosh, I need to share this with Mike. He loves this type of cat, or there's an article about the challenges of being a left-handed person. Your husband's a lefty. You say, you must read this right now. So it's really tapping into the idea of identity, is one key kind of theme. And then another theme is emotion. And people in the US really like sharing things that give you a warm and fuzzy feeling. So there is a lot of animal content that's extremely popular. We found that is not necessarily universal, although animal content can be popular in many places. The UK was the first place that we expanded internationally, and we found there people less than wanting to share warm and fuzzy content were more interested in kind of snarky, satirical type
Yeah, we're
content.
a hard-bitten, cynical bunch. That is true.
Exactly. So, to Coda's point before, one size doesn't fit all. You need to adapt, your style and the content for each market. It can't just be a rinse and repeat cycle.
Because the first thing I'd think about sharing is it's a culturally founded activity. You're sharing because you imagine, or you're pretty safe in the knowledge the person you're sharing with is going to find it as funny as you do. Otherwise, there's that kind of tumbleweed silence over the web when you share it and they go, what? Why did you do that? Which kind of suggests that when you came to think internationally, it's not the easiest thing straight away to say, okay, well, let's go into Europe or Asia or Middle East or wherever. What was the first driver for you thinking, well, we should really sort of share this whole business idea outside the US?
The first driver was really we had reached 40 million uniques in the US. We had Ben Smith who had come over from Politico and was beefing up our news coverage.
Do any of you guys sort of not switch between the same three companies the whole time, or is that?
There hasn't been, aside from the HuffPost mafia, kind of some of which came over to BuzzFeed, there hasn't been that much switching in between. But there's certainly overlap.
I interrupted. You'd reached that point where you're thinking it's time to go.
We've reached that point where we've seen the model was really working in the US, and we also found internet culture is global. That's the amazing thing that social platforms have done for news, is that previously you might have subscribed to your local newspaper and it was delivered within a certain radius. Now most people go onto social platforms for their news and can see a friend in Japan post something interesting and you read it. And so we realized with internet culture being global, we could have a leg up in starting our business in these other places. And not saying you can replicate it exactly, but at least you'd have a base of people who are already familiar with your content and may have seen something shared in a different market.
So we saw on some of the slides a few minutes ago, in fact, that it's quite surprising. A lot of the brands you see that are the leading news brands in certain markets are not local at all. They're from places you hadn't expected.
Definitely.
Mail Online, for example, being everywhere is really surprising, particularly if you're British.
The key part, I think, Coda was speaking about, they've partnered and grown through partnership quite a bit. We've taken a very different strategy where we have grown organically internationally. So we don't launch with partners typically. There's a recent exception to that, which I can talk about. But we've found that the key is to finding the right talent. And if you find great local talent, then they can build a team and basically adapt the model to the market.
So talk us through that first experience. You're there, you've reached that point, you're thinking, well, this is huge, and there's more growth here, we can go out and find it, but you've accepted this idea that other markets are different, do we need a partner, what do we do? And you're sitting there thinking, right, okay, let's start then. How? Where did you start? What was your first adventure? Tell us about that.
So the first adventure was in the UK, and that really came about from the founding editor we ended up hiring, emailing us and saying, I want to start BuzzFeed up over here, and almost harassing our lead editors at the time. And so they decided that they wanted someone to cover the off hours from the UK, but he, over time, convinced them he was the right person to start it up in the UK. And so he started in March 2013, and went on to hire maybe around 4 people for the kind of initial founding team. And I think in the beginning of that year, they had 2 million unique visitors. After 6 months, they had more than doubled that to 5 million. And by the end of the year, with about 10 people at that point, they'd quintupled it to 10 million unique visitors. So that was a sign to everyone that international expansion could work for BuzzFeed, even though we had to definitely modify the tone and the content to suit what the British people preferred.
So do you use UK spellings for your UK edition?
We, of course, use UK spelling.
Good,
so I was surprised to hear that, actually, because to me, I agree with John that if you're in a different market and you may speak English, let's say you live in France, you speak English, you still want to read French content, really. And that's been a premise of our international expansion, is to tailor it to the language and the cultural nuances.
So could you draw any lessons from that first? Because that almost sounds, you'll forgive me, but that was more accident than design. It came in through the window. The guy got on the phone or emailed you and said, look, let's do this. You went with it and it really worked.
Exactly.
So a lesson there that clearly this thing can work outside of the US. So did you simply take that model and say, well, that's simple, we'll just sit back and wait for the next guy to email us? Or was there more to it than that?
So I'd like to say that everything works out that easily. So one other thing that we did at the end of 2013 was to experiment with founding foreign language sites using Duolingo, which is a crowdsourced translation platform, where regular people can go on in order to learn a new language, practice translating different things.
I can't see any obvious pitfalls
Problems there. No, not at all. And so we launched 3 sites, an Espanol edition, a Portuguese edition, and a French edition using Duolingo, to crowdsource translate the bulk of our English content.
So let's just slow down a second.
Yep.
You've got the content in the US, it's been generated in English, or written is the old-fashioned term, and you're then sending that content through Duolingo and getting it crowdsourced, translated, and it's then posted on a Spanish or Portuguese version of the site.
Exactly, and we had an editor and a team reviewing the translations, but the clear takeaway from that experiment was that you have to be very careful about just taking US content, obviously, and translating it into a different language. There's a lot of nuance in language, there's a lot of nuance in culture, and people can tell if you're just generating a translation rather than creating something uniquely for the market. And so that's when we began to expand the teams for those editions. And Brazil's an example. We hired an amazing founding editor there. A similar story, so this is not completely different from the UK. She was creating BuzzFeed-style content and saying, I want to start BuzzFeed in Brazil. And she gave us comments on the site as it was with the translations, and we thought she was fantastic. And now Brazil is our 3rd largest site beyond the US and the UK. It just surpassed Canada in June, which is kind of shocking. So she has done that with a team of 10. There are around 13 million unique visitors from Brazil now.
That's amazing. So model number 1 was the almost, I won't call it an accident, but it was.
Yep.
Model number 2 was the automated translation. Are we now going to draw a veil over that and say that wasn't a great idea, or was that?
Yeah, I would say that it was a good start, and it was an experiment.
It got you in there.
And we got it going, and then we realized, obviously, we need to find the great talent, and that's really what BuzzFeed is built upon. People who have a voice, people who understand web culture, which does differ by each place.
So you've got the editor in the UK, you've got an editor in Brazil. Did these 2 experiences then give you a kind of playbook that you could then say, okay, now we know how to do it, now let's go out and find new markets and apply the same model?
Yeah, I hate to say, I don't think we have a template per se. Each place is different, and you need to find the right editor for that location, and you need to nurture the team in the right way, and they need to develop their own voice. But definitely after that, we started to more rapidly expand, launching in Australia. We launched an India site. We launched, obviously built out the French site. We launched a German site. And so now we're up to our 9 editions. I wouldn't say, though, that we're going to follow the same playbook everywhere we go. One example is we just announced a joint venture with Yahoo Japan to launch a Japanese BuzzFeed site. And we're doing that through a joint venture. And we really decided to do that there, even though that departs from our organic strategy historically, because one, Japan is so culturally different. We felt like a partner could really help us understand the nuances better and get us going faster. And the second reason was obviously they are an 100-pound gorilla in that market. They have a team of 500 salespeople who have extensive relationships with all of the brands, and obviously with Dentsu as well. So there, both the advantages of the partner and the difference in the culture made it worthwhile for us to do that. So it's something that we're open to thinking about for other markets. So there's no one playbook that we'll use, but we definitely favor starting up on our own with a team.
So ideally, you'd have an editor in place first who then sets the editorial sort of tone for BuzzFeed in that country because of their local knowledge and their understanding of the culture and what's going to work. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yep.
So let me ask you then about the tricky question of editorial control.
Yep.
So you've now got all these editions around the world. There's got to be somebody sitting in the US thinking, I just want to make sure that all these sites are they're actually BuzzFeed and not just some kind of local thing that's called BuzzFeed, but really isn't us at all. How do you manage that tricky thing of having these really powerful local editors? Because in many cases they've come to you, they feel ownership, but there's got to be some kind of, you can't really do that, or that's not quite in brand. How does that work?
So Scott Lamb, who's my counterpart on the international expansion front, manages those editors in the various countries. And they're constantly talking, and I would say you have to really trust the people. And if you hear of things that aren't working, we have extensive fan bases in these countries, and also the team of editors that are working there will tell you if something seems off-brand or isn't really working. But you have to have faith. We have a very startup-y culture still, even though we're a large company at this point. And that really starts with saying, this is your baby. You have to try to grow it and see how it goes.
Okay, so that's, which sounds eminently sensible.
Yeah.
And now in all these conversations, we start out with a high degree of purity and we talk about editorial, but at some point someone kind of sidles up behind us and says, what about the money?
Yeah.
How does that work? Are you offering global packages using all of these sites? Is it down to the local partner to generate revenue and then do a profit or revenue share with the parent company? How does it work?
Sure, so similar to our editorial strategy, we're very organic in how we grow from a business perspective. So all of our advertising is done in-house. 100% of our revenue is generated through native advertising that we create. So it's not as easy as saying, using a partner or a rep firm in these places to sell display advertising onto our site. So the way we've expanded in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, and now we've just recently launched a business team in Brazil, is again hiring a head salesperson who knows that market, who's from that market, and can translate our native advertising our native advertising product to the country.
So you've got in-country teams generating native content that works for that country.
Exactly. So it's very similar to our editorial model. We do some global deals, but I think as someone said earlier, it can be hard to do a global deal for native advertising because the content needs to be customized to each local market. So that's one tricky thing about that, but we certainly work with brands that have presences in all of these places and do some multi-country buys.
So you have success. In a moment, I do want to ask you about what your sort of one takeaway would be for everyone here. If you're about to embark on a global expansion program like yours, what's the one thing you'd leave them with? Before we do that, rather than monopolizing the conversation, can I see a waving hand in the audience if you have a particular question you'd like to get in to this conversation? Don't feel compelled, but do make a large signal because it's hard to see from up here. There is one over there indeed, thank you. It's good to have someone here who can actually see rather than just me. It is hard. So we have a lady over there with her hand raised, and it's right there. Someone hurl a green cube at that lady, please. It's a long shot, but you can do that. You can make that throw. That's easy. Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. You're already there with the question. Oh, I thought you were about to throw the cube. I'm terribly sorry.
Okay.
Could you tell us your name and organization, please, just so we all know, and then ask your question?
Sure. I'm Angie McKagan. I work for St. Joseph Communications. My question was actually about all of these international satellite versions of BuzzFeed. How do you get the culture that BuzzFeed has obviously been so successful in growing in the United States? How do you replicate that culture in all of your satellites?
I mean, it's really about, I hate to keep going back to this, but it's about the talent that we find in those countries. And those people who really know what is popular in web culture in those places. So in the UK, it's understanding that the warm and fuzzy won't share quite as well as perhaps something that's more satirical or snarky. Or understanding that in France, political news is actually important, so it might be something that we would want to start with earlier in the edition there than we have in other places. So it's really finding the people, similar to how Jonah Peretti found great editors in the US who got US web culture. It's finding those people in the other places who are leaders in thinking about that. A lot of these places are still dominated by, Brazil, is dominated by portals. Japan is quite dominated by portals. And so it's finding people that understand where the sharing culture is in these places and how to grow that.
Okay, thank you for that. And can we get the cube forward to the person that was vainly pleading for it earlier?
Thank you. In the
You might need to hold it sort of up a little bit. That's better.
Irina Zabrowska, Russia Direct. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there was one exception, that you launched the website with a local publisher, and I don't think you touched upon this. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I was referring to Japan, where we decided to partner with Yahoo Japan in a joint venture to launch BuzzFeed there. And as I said, it was really because of one, the extreme cultural differences between the Japanese market and other markets where we are. One of them being that Facebook has much lower penetration in Japan than it does in a lot of the markets where we are, and that's one of the primary platforms upon which our content is spread. And so we thought Yahoo Japan's insight into the market would be valuable, and then also obviously their strength in business there, their extensive ad sales force and ties with Dentsu.
Okay, I'm sure there are more questions. Sadly, time is, as always, against us. So it's the $64,000 question, which, if you could leave the audience with one piece of advice, if you've just learned one thing in your time at BuzzFeed, expanding into all these markets, it could be what you would do or what you would never do again. What's the single lesson we should take away?
So I think this is going to be perhaps a disappointing answer, but it's that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. You really have to approach each market differently and get to know its nuances, get to know the talent there, and understand whether a partner would be a good strategy in the market. So I think that the one takeaway would be, don't take a playbook and try to replicate it in every single place you go. Evaluate each place separately.
Great. Can I ask you please to thank Anne Hogarty? Anne, thank you.
Thank you.